This week is Parshat Acharei Mot, and Acharei Mot literally means after death. And so I have my Chumash here, and this is a portion that is in the congregational world is very well known because we read this on Yom Kippur, because it puts forth the service in the temple on the Day of Atonement. And it begins, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe, and the Lord spoke to Moshe, Acharei Mot Shnei Bnei Aharon, immediately after the two sons of Aaron died. And then God speaks, and he says what he says. He outlines the service. Now, generally, this portion, it's not uncommon that it is read as a double portion. That is, it is read with the next portion. Sometimes two portions are read together. And what follows this portion is the portion of Kedoshim, holy.
Kedoshim, yeah.
So the movement, Shuli, if everyone. So the movement is from Acharei Mot.
Rabbi, sorry, can I just ask people if I mute you to please not unmute yourself? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're moving from Acharei Mot to Kedoshim. And it's really serendipitous. I don't know if it's the right way to use the word, but it's certainly interesting that invariably we read this portion on the Shabbat before, maybe sometimes after, most of the times before Yom Hashoah. It's really something that we read this portion, Acharei Mot, after the death, and it's an inexplicable death of the two of the four sons of Aaron. Right now, right this Shabbat. Now, of course, two sons, as terrible as that is, and for a parent, that could be the equivalent of the Har of Haras, but that's not 6 million Jews. But we read it. I do remember that now it's almost 40 years ago, in May of 1985, in the beginning of May, some of you may remember that the President of the United States then, Ronald Reagan, decided at the request of Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor of Germany, that he was going to travel to Bitburg and he was going to lay a wreath at the graves of the SS Waffen. And this was Kohl's way of saying, it's 40 years, let's put the wreath down, it's the past. And Elie Wiesel, a blessed memory, he in the White House was to speak, and in front of the president, he said to Ronald Reagan, your place is not with them, your place is with us. And there was a tremendous outcry in the Jewish community and beyond. There have been books that have been written about this. Now it's a footnote in history, and many people have forgotten what occurred. But as a way of mollifying the Jewish community, if you remember, Reagan then decided that he was going to go to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen is a place where just tens of thousands of Jews and many more, scores of thousands of Jews were murdered. That's where Anne Frank died. She died in Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen actually is in Germany as well. And he said, I'll go to Bergen-Belsen too. That is to say, I'll go to Bergen-Belsen, then I'll go to Bitburg. And when we first heard this, activists were thinking about it, is that enough of a mollification? But then Reagan actually drew a moral equivalency between the SS Waffen and the Jewish victims. That is to say, he said that the SS Waffen, they were also victims. Now, once he drew that parallel, there was just an outcry. And at that time, Rabbi Ronnie Schwartzberg was the co-rabbi with me. And we actually traveled to Bergen-Belsen, we announced, like, you know how it is. You make these big announcements that we're going into Bergen-Belsen for Shabbat. Reagan was to be there on Sunday morning. And we announced that we're not going to let the President of the United States into Bergen-Belsen, because if he goes to Bitburg, he is desecrating the Bergen-Belsen camp, as if we could stop him. But once you make that announcement, certainly the day or 2 days before an event, the news media is interested in covering it. And with two schleppers, with a couple of German Jews, we arrived to Bergen-Belsen, and the whole international press corps was there. And we stayed for Shabbat. And then we were dragged out. And I still remember reading the Torah. We brought a Torah into the camp. I think it was the first time since the war that a Torah was read on Shabbat in the camp. And the portion was Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. I still remember that. One could look it up. You can look up the calendar. But at the first Shabbat of May in 1985, it was about May 3rd, May 4th, May 5th, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. And I remember Rabbi Schwartzberg, who has a whole history, his family history is in the Shoah. He said that as we were reading this, he could hear his relatives crying out from the ground, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. And so what I'd like to do today, just to commemorate Yom HaShoah, is to say a little bit about the Shoah and to reflect upon some of our classic thinkers in the 20th century, what they said about the 6 million, observations that they made in the spirit of Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, Acharei Mot, after death, Kedoshim. There's, of course, a rabbinic joke that people have the best to say about you after death. After death, you become holy. During life, sometimes it's another story. After death, the person whom I'm mourning for was an absolute saint. The person never did any wrong. Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. Heroes are often more heroic after they're gone than in life. And so I'd like to discuss with you, just mention a few thinkers. The first thinker, whom we all know, is Elie Wiesel, who wrote extensively on the Shoah. His book Night is a bestseller. It's the story of his testimony, witnessing the death of his father in the camp. But he also wrote a book called Legends of Our Time. And in Legends of Our Time, he touches on discussing why in the camps was there not more resistance? Why? Now, there's an expression, Al tadun et chavercha shetagia limkomo. Nobody should judge anyone until you're in their place. And when you're psychologically, you've been driven in the ground and you're in one of those camps, and there's even one SS officer surrounded by 20 inmates. So the questions that people often ask when that occurred, why didn't the 20 inmates just tear that SS officer apart? Nobody can make those judgments. Nobody can make those judgments. Who knows? I don't know what I would do in such a circumstances if one has been mentally beaten and if you've been turned into someone who was not even human. But Wiesel deals with this, and he wonders, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, he struggles with it. Those who were there, the victims, after their death, could we call them Kedoshim? Could we really call them holy? I mean, why wasn't there more resistance? And he writes, the transport of which I was a part did not rebel on the night of our arrival. What must be added is that the young men spoke also of the necessity of alerting the outside world. In other words, the transport arrives. This is Elie Wiesel's account. And they were young men, young and strong, and they said, look, we have got to stand up and alert the world. And Wiesel continues, they still believe the Germans were doing their works secretly, like thieves, that the Allies knew nothing about it. We will fight, they said. We will break the silence of the world. We will tell the world that Auschwitz is a reality. And then Wiesel offers this testimony. I shall never forget the old man who, in a calm voice, terribly calm, answered them. So this is now, as the young men cry out, we will fight because we want to alert the world, as if the world doesn't know. And then Wiesel says there was an old man who then said, is quoted as saying the following, you are young and brave, my children. You still have a lot to learn. The world knows. No need to inform it. It knew before you did, but it doesn't care. It won't lose a minute thinking about our fate. Your revolt will have no bearing, no echo. And when the young man hears this, I'm now just jumping a paragraph, the young men respond, even if you are right, they rejoined, even if what you say is true, that doesn't change the situation. Let us prove our courage and our dignity. Let us show these murderers in the world that Jews know how to die like free men, not like hunched up invalids. And the old man responds and he says, as a lesson, I like that. The old man's voice reached me, but they don't deserve it. Wow, let's think about that. He says, as a lesson, not bad, but they don't deserve it. And then he concludes, and this is what I really want to share with you. At the risk of offending, he knows that he may be offending certain people who would read this, who were alive when he wrote this in the 70s or 80s. At the risk of offending, it must be emphasized that the victims suffered more and more profoundly from the indifference of the onlookers than from the brutality of the executioners. The cruelty of the enemy would have been incapable of breaking the prisoner. It was the silence of those he believed to be his friends, cruelty more cowardly, more subtle, which broke his heart. That's very powerful. I don't know if it's true for everyone, but what he's saying is that even more difficult for those in the camps, this is what he's writing here, than the German SS, more difficult than the brutality of the executioner was the recognition that the world, the free world in a position to stand up and say something, was silent. And I repeat his sentence, he writes, the cruelty of the enemy would have been incapable of breaking the prisoner. It was the silence of those he believed to be his friends which broke his heart. Again, I want to read that first sentence, that the victims suffered more and more profoundly from the indifference of the onlookers than from the brutality of the executioner. And he concludes, at Auschwitz, not only man died, but also the idea of man. What does that mean? What does that mean? Because the idea of man, the idyllic idea of man, is that human beings are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. And in the image of God, we possess the potential to walk this world, to use a term that my dear Rabbi Yitz Greenberg always uses. with human dignity. We have a choice to live with dignity or to abuse our humanness and lack that dignity. And so at Auschwitz, not only man died, not only did 6 million die, but the idea of man, the dream of man, because of the silence of the world, that died as well. To live in a world where there is nothing anymore, where the executioner acts as God, as judge, many wanted no part of it. It was its own heart the world incinerated at Auschwitz. In other words, at Auschwitz, not only did man die, the idea of man, the essence of man, the soul of man, what man and woman, if I may add, when Rousseau wrote, man was always understood in the generic sense. Now we're careful, man, woman. Not only did woman and man die, but the idea of a persona. Let me put it in my words, that what I'm culling from Eli is the following, that Eli is saying that some of those in the camps, were we to ask them, why didn't you fight back? They would say the following, because the world is not worth it. He saw the silence in the camps as an act of resistance. Now, he's not offering this as an idea which is an absolute idea true for all. It's a thought which he has. It's a thought. And what he's saying is that people in the Shoah, the victims of the Shoah, was saying, if this is the world, you can have it. If this is what it's all about, it's not for me. Really it's a framing of an idea as it relates to Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, as it relates to resistance, which I think is quite formidable. That's one approach to resistance that I wanted to share with you. Now, there is another approach to Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, and I want to just show you this book. This book is called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. And my purpose in our session today, and I'll speak for about another 5 minutes, and then I want to open it up. I know you have much to teach me about this. My purpose is to say something wholly about those who were there, something about the Kedoshim, Acharei Mot. And there are questions that people are asking, and we're especially offering responses now as it relates to what appears on the surface to have been a lack of resistance. Yafa, of blessed memory, and I owe her so much personally, my mother, who never went to college when she was a youngster, in her early 40s, went back to Brooklyn College. My mother was really a brilliant woman. And I still remember she would come back, and I was a teenager then, and she told me about the classes at Brooklyn College with Yafa Eliach. And Yafa spoke at the Bayit when we didn't even have a structure. We just had a little house. And I consider her talk that she gave at the Bayit, that I still have on tape, the old tape recorders, one of the best talks I ever heard at the Bayit. And we've had, over the years, a slew of happenings, a slew of speakers. And she was the first one who introduced me to the idea of spiritual resistance. Now, there were physical resistors in the Holocaust, from the Warsaw Ghetto to all kinds of uprisings that have been studied Mordechai Anilovich. And there are so many, I may have mispronounced his last name. I used to know the names, but now I'm closer to 80 than 75. So unfortunately, it's escaping me. But these were my heroes in the activist world. There were just tremendous numbers of people who stood up and who fought. God bless them. When I was a young activist in the shul, survivors used to say, "Oh, if you were rabbi, if you were alive during the Shoah, it would have all been different." Yeah, it would have been all different. I have sleepless nights in those days and wondering how would I have reacted. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would have been one of those who would have, I don't know. Only God knows. So she, Yafa, God bless her soul, introduced the idea of spiritual resistance. That's a very, very different concept. Spiritual resistance. And, when one thinks about resistance, we automatically think about physical resistance, and there's truth to that. But separate from physical resistance, there's also spiritual resistance. And she wrote this book, which has sold, I'm told, several 100,000 copies. Most Jewish titles, if they sell 2,000, that's a lot. This has sold several 100,000. And she opens us up to the whole idea of resistance. I treasure, she gave this to me that night, and she inscribed it, Ma'at or min hachoshech hagadol, a little bit of light in great darkness. And I treasure it, bididut uvahokara. What a great lady she was. I just want to read to you one of her many, many stories in the spirit of Acharei, Mot, and Kedoshim. And all of these stories were very, very, very carefully investigated. This one is her first. It's called Above the Pit. It was a dark, cold night in the Janoska road camp. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air. You are all to evacuate the barracks immediately and report to the vacant lot. Anyone remaining inside will be shot on the spot. Pandemonium broke out in the barracks. People pushed their way to the doors while screaming the names of friends and relatives. In a panic-stricken stampede, the prisoners ran in the direction of the big open field. Exhausted, trying to catch their breath, they reached the field. In the middle were two huge pits. Suddenly, with their last drop of energy, the inmates realized where they were rushing on that cursed dark night in Janoska. By the way, I'm not sure, maybe someone could Google it. I think Janoska's in the Ukraine. I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all. Once more, the cold, healthy voice roared in the night. Each of you dogs who values his miserable life and wants to cling to it must jump over one of the pits and land on the other side. Those who miss will get what they rightfully deserve. Rat-ta-ta-ta-ta. Imitating the sound of a machine gun, the voice trailed off into the night, followed by a wild, coarse laughter. It was clear to the inmates that they would all end up in the pits. Even at the best of times, it would have been impossible to jump over them, all the more so on the cold, dark night in Janoska. Janowska. The prisoners standing at the edge of the pits were skeletons, feverish from disease and starvation, exhausted from slave labor and sleepless nights. Though the challenge that had been given them was a matter of life and death, they knew that the SS and the Ukrainian guards, they knew that for the SS and the Ukrainian guards, it was merely another devilish game. So clearly this was Ukraine. Her first story. Look, the truth is, when I was younger, my father said to me that Ukrainians there were times he said they were worse than the Nazis. We've discussed this, and that today we don't believe in intergenerational, collective, vertical punishment. And then it continues. Among the thousands of Jews on that field in Janowska in Ukraine was the rabbi of Beluzhov, Rabbi Israel Spira. By the way, he survived and he lived in Borough Park and he died almost at the age of 100. Many of her stories about Rabbi Spira, so she was able to really make sure each one was true. He, Rabbi Spira, was standing with a friend, a free thinker from a large Polish town whom the rabbi had met in the camp. A deep friendship had developed between the two, between this free thinker and the rabbi. Spira, all of our efforts to jump over the pits are in vain. We only entertain the Germans and their collaborators. Let's sit down in the pits and wait for the bullets to end our wretched existence, said the non-believer to the rabbi. My friend, said the rabbi, as they were walking in the direction of the pits, man must obey the will of God. If it was decreed from heaven that pits be dug and we be commanded to jump, pits will be dug and jump we must. And if God forbid we fail and fall into the pits, we will reach the world of truth a second later after our attempt. So my friend, we must jump. The rabbi and his friend were nearing the edge of the pits. The pits were rapidly filling up with bodies. The rabbi glanced down at his feet, the swollen feet of the 53-year-old Jew, ridden with starvation and disease. He looked at his young friend, the skeleton with burning eyes. As they reached the pit, the rabbi closed his eyes and commanded in a powerful whisper, "We are jumping. We are jumping." When they opened their eyes, they found themselves standing on the other side of the pit. Spira, we are here, we are here, we are alive, the friend repeated over and over again, while warm tears streamed from his eyes. Spira, for your sake, I am alive. Indeed, there must be a God in heaven. Tell me, Rebbe, how did you do it? I was holding on, the Rebbe said, to my ancestral merit. I was holding on to the coattails of my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather of blessed memory, said the rabbi, and his eyes searched the black skies above. Tell me, my friend, the rabbi is now speaking to the non-believer. Tell me, my friend, how did you reach the other side of the pit? I was holding on to you, replied the rabbi's friend. And then in italics, based on a conversation of the Grand Rabbi of Bluzha, Rabbi Israel Spira, with Baruch Singer, January 3rd, 1975. Whether you believe this or don't believe it, you know, if you're a person of the spirit, I just recently spoke with somebody, I asked how they're doing, and the person said, I'm not doing well, I think I'm dying. And I was wondering to myself, is there anything physically wrong with that person? Is it emotional? Now, one could argue, what's the difference? If it's emotional, you know, if one is emotionally down, that can affect our eating patterns, and one may not eat. And if we're not going to eat, we are going to die. But I think it's important to know, because if it's psychological, then it has to be treated psychologically. And treated psychologically has something to do with lifting the spirits. And I love the concept of to measure resistance, not only in terms of the physical resistance in the camps, and there was some, and let no one judge anyone who was not there, who was there from the eyes of those who were not there, but spiritual resistance. And so Elie Wiesel talks about Acharei Mot-Kedoshim as what is the holiness? The holiness of the resistance was the silence was an act of resistance. And for Yafa, what is it? It's the spiritual resistance. And I close this part of our little talk, our little session, shiur, with the words of my Rebbe, Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, who had a profound effect on my life. All three people did. Elie did. I felt a close relationship with Elie. I often spoke to him about different issues related to the Shoah, related to safety of Jews, often spent time in his apartment. Yafa Eliach, a woman who was really my Rebbe, my teacher. She was married to the great David Eliach, who was the principal of Yeshiva Flatbush. To this day, I follow a custom I first heard from him, and that is to sing the ketubah, because the ketubah, the marriage document, is it's a document which is a love document. I actually sang that ketubah at Ivanka Trump's wedding. I sang the ketubah Jared and Ivanka were there. And just anecdotally on the side, Trump being Trump, he's standing right near me. And as I'm through, I'm wondering what he's going to tell me. So he looks down at me. He's a tall man. And he says, "Good job, Rabbi." What are you going to do? Try to create a moment. "Good job, Rabbi." And I pushed back. I said, "Oh, you mean I'm not fired? Okay." So that was David Eliach, just a great, great trailblazer in Jewish education. And then there was Eliezer Berkovitz, whom I just mentioned. Eliezer Berkovitz wrote a classic work on the Shoah called Faith After the Holocaust. And before this shiur, I was looking for it. I must have picked up that book. Shuli knows this. I have so many copies and I can't find a copy here. I guess I use it so often, I don't know where I put it. I'm just looking over here. But what a magnificent book. I remember when we were protesting against the Pope's embrace of Waldheim, an unrepentant Nazi. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations. His portrait is still hanging in the United Nations, 2 portraits. It's an outrage. Talk about taking statues down. Waldheim's portrait in 2 places is in the Secretariat building of the United Nations. And then he became president of Austria. And when the Pope embraced him, we felt the Pope was giving him legitimacy. So we traveled to St. Peter's Square. And I walked into St. Peter's Square with one book in my hand, Eliezer Berkowitz's Faith After the Holocaust. And I still remember a paragraph that he wrote. He said that the Holocaust, this is what he wrote. He was very strong. Please don't misunderstand this. He said the Holocaust, he wrote, was more a Christian tragedy than a Jewish tragedy. I leave that for everybody to think about. It's somewhat similar to Wiesel. What he's saying there is, of course, it was a Jewish tragedy. It was a Jewish tragedy. Nothing compares. But it was a Christian tragedy in that the Vatican was silent. Silent. That's why we've raised a big fuss about convents and churches at Auschwitz, because 100 years from now, all that's going to be left in these decaying camps are these churches, big crosses hovering over the camps. And people will believe that either the Holocaust was an attempt at Christian, mostly Catholic genocide, or that the Vatican was protecting Jews, when that's not the case. In fact, the Vatican, it hurts me to say this, were protecting Nazis as they escaped Germany and fled to South America after the war. After the war. And that's what he meant, that it was more a Christian tragedy. The silence of the Vatican. He was talking he wasn't talking in a real way. Of course, the 6 million was the greater tragedy. But in the beginning of the book, he makes a statement about Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, and he talks about, can we really say that all of those who were there were holy? It's not the case. All of them were holy. There were people who went to death cursing God, saying, I don't believe in God. Maybe they took their Bibles and ripped the Bibles in half. And then he magnificently said, and we quote this in our Seder of Yom Hashoah, and I hope you'll tune in this Thursday evening because it's all on Zoom. It won't be in person because we felt, Rev. Stephen felt it would jeopardize the health of survivors. But he wrote the following. I want to share this and then open it up to your input. He wrote, let it be said clearly. I don't have it in front of me, I'm paraphrasing. But he said, those who went to their death, crying out, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Those individuals who went to their death saying, I still believe, God. I still believe. They were martyred. They died as holy believers. But those who went to death screaming, damn you, God, there is no God. Cursed may you be, God. Those who perished cursing God were no less holy. They were holy disbelievers. Holy believers and holy disbelievers. Something to think about. Sometimes Eliezer Berkovitz had the power to say something in a sentence and you just sit and, wow, you just want to think about it. What does he mean? What does he mean by that? 3 thoughts from 3 different thinkers as we're on the eve of Yom Hashoah, Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, Elie Wiesel, the resistance of silence. I would push back on that because I think we shouldn't be silent, but it's a powerful, powerful point. The resistance of silence, that the suffering was more from the onlookers who were silent, especially in the free world, than from those who were there. Didn't mean it literally, but it's a powerful point. And Yafa's spiritual resistance, that when we evaluate resistance, it should be on many different levels. And Eliezer Berkovitz is magnificent. They were all holy, all Kedoshim. Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. Acharei Mot-Kedoshim. Holy believers and the no less holy disbelievers. So I want to stop here and I want to get everybody's input, and then I want to say one final word from the writings of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Please.
Avi?
Yes, I want to ask Shui to call on people, okay?
Yes, so I see that Tova's hand has been up, and let me just look at the screen. I then see Estelle's hand and Natalie's hand, and then I see Bev's. So we have Tova, Estelle, Natalie, and Bev. If I missed you, please put up your hand again. Okay, so that's what we have for now. Tova first.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that that like Elie Wiesel wrote after the camps, when he was out. And there was resistance in the camp, just trying to stay alive, just helping others to stay alive. That was resistance, because their dream when they were in the camp was to come back to the wonderful world from which they were taken. And then they came, those who came back did come back, they found that it was not that wonderful world. They realized that the world knew about what was happening and did nothing. And some of them, when they tried to speak, people said, oh, no, what you're saying cannot be true, because if it were true, you would not be here to tell about it. And so they stopped speaking and they started to be silent. But when somebody dies, as you said, we always think of the good things. When you read about a victim and people speak about him only, and whoever was a victim was always the best kind of person, because that's the way we like to think of the world. We like to think of the goodness, and we try to learn from that goodness and set aside what was not the best.
I appreciate it. Really, beautifully said as usual, Tova. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. When you were talking about the old man in the camp who said that nobody will care, and basically it was the desecration of man. Why is this different? I know it was more horrible, but when you think of the Inquisition, where they burned people alive, was man any less desecrated at that time? And through all the years, with all the cruelty against men throughout the generations that this is the way we have lived, is man always to be desecrated? Is that the general status of man?
I mean, that's my question, because you're not answering that at all.
Well, what you're saying is, of course, correct. We have seen, when one looks at history, one sees to what low depths a human being can sink, lower than the animal.
Constantly.
Lower than animals who don't murder their own. On the other hand, there is great glory when one looks at the history of the world. And the world produced saints and seers and sages. The world produced those who represented the opposite. And this is, Estelle, this is our challenge. This is what the Torah is all about. The Torah, I would say, is attempts to contribute to help humankind make this world a better world.
It's not doing very well, is it?
Well, when one looks at Ukraine and one looks at Israel and what happened recently in Nigeria and what's going on in China, of course, there's great horror. But I would, it is not a coincidence, Estelle. There was a great debate when Yom HaShoah should be. The international community doesn't observe Yom HaShoah. In the international community, it's January 27th, which is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. There are many in the Orthodox community who observe and commemorate on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. They include it in the fast for the temple. There was a thought that Acharei B'Tevet, after all, there were many people who died and nobody said Kaddish for them. And there was a move that on the 10th day of Tevet, which is a minor fast day, that should be what was called the Yom HaKaddish, the day of Kaddish. I believe with all my heart that the reason why the Knesset of Israel, and that's the heart of the Jewish people, arguably, but this is this is, for whatever it's worth, what I feel. The Knesset purposely said Yom HaShoah is going to be a week before Chag Ha'atzmaut, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And yes, when one looks back on the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, there were horrific happenings. The Shoah, Cambodia, and horrific stuff going on. But at the same time, we're a very privileged generation, Estelle. You know that. Your husband was involved. It's no small matter that the state of Israel was established, and it is where it is today. It had 600,000 Jews then, and now it is what? 1,000% or 10,000? I don't know. It's got
8 million.
Almost 7 million Jews. I heard recently that, and this is just one area where the Ukrainian president said, all right, he'll sign some agreement, but he wants certain countries to sign that if something happens to Ukraine, they're going to come to their defense. Who are those countries? He signed America, England, Germany, and Israel. Now that's just in defense. We all know what Israel has done. Estelle, I have tears of joy when I say we've lived through one of the greatest liberation movements of our time, the freedom of Soviet Jewry. Somebody would have said, Estelle, going back to 1970, that the Iron Gate is going to come down, the Iron Wall, whatever it was called, the Iron Curtain, and 2 million Jews are going to leave. You said they're crazy. They're crazy. It's happened. Ethiopian Jewry. I'm not putting down all of the horrors, but that's what the Shoah is about. The Shoah, who wrote this? Viktor Frankl said it. Viktor Frankl survived 4 camps, and yet he wrote a book called In Search of Meaning. What was he saying? He said he saw in the camps people, I don't stand in judgment, but he saw people sink to even lower depths. There were Jews who were Judenrats. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, I think the majority, he saw people even then, even in those situations, people have choice. And the choice is, are we going to live let me use the its word again, with dignity or non-dignity? Are we going to realize the image of God or not? That's our challenge.
Well, then you were against what that old man said. You should. Then you were for the young man who said, "Please, let's fight for our freedom." I mean, you're the one who was telling that story. So the old man was mistaken, was incorrect in what he was saying.
You know, Brad Hirschfield wrote a book that's called "Because I'm Right Doesn't Mean You're Wrong." And when one deals with these issues, I don't think there are any absolute answers.
Well, you're right. I don't mean that.
I think the old man, and who knows what old mean, they're probably much younger than I am now, but I think he said something real that we have to think about. And just as what you've just said is very real and equally correct. Who's up now?
Question.
Estelle. Yeah. The questions are much better than whatever little I have to offer, believe me. The more I know about this, the less I know about it.
We have Natalie, and then we have Bev and Ted.
Okay. What I would like to suggest is the way that the Nazis and the Russians control the Jews is with fear. The fear of reprisal is so great because they're so cruel. They could shoot somebody just for not turning around or for not standing up or for sitting down. And they shoot them on the spot. So the reprisals are real and they're horrible to even think about. And that's how they control the Jews from rising up, because if they rise up, there's going to be so much death and horror, even more than what they're suffering now.
It's beautiful.
And that's how they control them.
Yeah.
So from day to day, just to stay alive, as Tova said, that was a triumph.
Yes, absolutely. I agree, Natalie. You know, how does one deal with the fear? Can one deal with it, or how does one deal with it? It's a deep question. Maybe I'll give some thought to that. We'll all give some thought, and maybe one day we'll have a session on what you just said. Thank you, Natalie. And my dear Ted and Bev. Thank you, Natalie.
I have to agree that you didn't mention reprisal, but before anyone took any action, they knew that many numbers would be shot because of it. Anyone trying to escape, there was an automatic 25 people were shot because of it. And I happen to know someone whose husband was one of the 25, did nothing. He just counted 25, got shot, and that was it. But the truth of apathy, everybody, home line, everybody is calling for apathy as the big problem that Jews face. Is that from being too comfortable? Is that from having too much security, that the Jews really feel that it will all be all right? It's, you know, and one does not want to go around with a pessimistic attitude on life, on the world, you know, so the hope is that it will be all right. And does that cause the apathy? Because truly, Elie Wiesel said it, Malcolm Homeline advertises it on JBS, the real enemy is apathy. So if we know the enemy, how do we go about dealing with it? And that's a question, I believe, that we need to face. It's not only, you know, when you say we should deal with the topic of fear, I think it definitely has to be tied in with apathy. And so I look forward to a session like that because the Holocaust survivors that I know all agree that that was the most horrendous, that nobody really cared to do anything, not countries, not people. Of course, there were exceptions, but that's the bottom line.
Hello? Rabbi Weiss, can I speak?
I think Ted wanted to say something. Ted?
Did you want to say something?
Can I speak, Rabbi
Well,
Weiss?
I have one comment. I see a contradiction in the expression that those who cursed God as they were being murdered were not disbelievers, as it seemed to be said, but they just had how can you curse God if you disbelieve in God? You are saying, I disbelieve in the goodness of God, but and I think God is bad, but those people I wouldn't consider disbelievers.
I love that, Ted. I really, I love that. You know, I think I've always, I really stand corrected. I've said in the past that when, Ted, when a couple comes for some pastoral counseling and they're screaming at each other, I'm in good shape. If they're screaming and saying, I'm in good shape, they're talking. But if they're not talking, so that's what then I'm in bad shape. So what you're saying is that, when someone says, I curse you, God, but that's a relationship. That's what I'm hearing you say. It means you believe something. I really, Ted, thank you so much. It's a beautiful point. Yep. Thank you, my Rebbe. Thank you. I think Zalman's next. So
yes.
Then I just want to say a word and then we'll close.
Okay, there were a few other hands, but maybe we don't have time. Stuart, you can unmute yourself now. Thank you for waiting. Are you able to unmute yourself? Yeah, we hear you now. Great.
Okay. In 1938 and 1939, there was called the Evian Bain conference, where all the nations got together, and there was a subject. They wanted who will take in the Jews, and no country except the Dominican Republic for different reasons. No country wanted to. That was before the Holocaust, before the concentration, 1938, 1939, both 2 years in Evian Bain, France, and that was the concentration camp started in 1941-42. With the Nazi conference, but 1938, once Hitler saw that no Jews, that no nations would take care of the Jews, he was free to do that. And I'm not talking about the kinder but I'm talking about the real. There was a lot. All the Jews could have been. All the nations could have taken a certain amount. Okay, you hear me? All the nations, all the nations could have taken. Okay, you hear what I'm saying?
I do, Zalman. Thank you. Thank you for that input.
We created extermination. That was 1942. That was 1938, 1939. They could have taken, all the nations could have taken a certain amount of Jews and we've been saved.
Right. Who's up now, Shuli?
I thought that I saw Roseanne's hand. Am I correct, Roseanne? Just nod if your hand was up. I don't know if I saw that correctly. Yes, Roseanne. And then I think Ruth left. Okay. Is that correct? Ruth, Did you have a hand up? No, you're muted. But okay, so Roseanne.
I just wanted to say that people were put on the freight cars for 2 days without food or water, and they were so crowded that if you died, you wouldn't even fall down. So it's very difficult to raise a rebellion when you can barely walk.
Yes. I just want to thank you, Roseanne. I I'm looking at Fern now, and I don't know what Fern's going to be doing today, but I know it's going to be something uplifting. Am I right, Fern?
No, unfortunately, I tested positive for COVID last night.
Oh, wow.
So I'm quarantined. Thank you. Thank you.
How are you feeling?
Thank God. I mean, it's like a little bit of a cold, you know, scratchy and stuffy. I was hoping today, before I tested last night, that I was going to come to Riverdale and do the class from Wave Hill. But unfortunately, 10:30 last night, I just said I better test myself, and
Wow.
we're going to go. Yeah. So no excursions today.
Just be careful, but this is dedicated to you.
Oh, thank you.
Something Rabbi Soloveitchik said, and we'll close with this. You know that there were many people asking why this happened, many rabbis. And he wrote a book on, basically it's his book on theodicy. Theodicy means if God is so good, why is there evil? In the most, the biggest, in the largest sense, how could there be a Shoah? Where was God? People always asking that question. And I just want to offer an observation that he makes. He says, as to the question of why, his language is, I don't have it in front of me, but I've memorized this. He said, that is a metaphysical, speculative question for which there is no answer. He says, when evil occurs, we often don't know the answer to why. But then he writes, rather than focus on why, we should recognize, now these are his words, Te'udato shel Adam lahafoch goral liyud. The mission in life for all is to turn fate into destiny. I love that line. To turn fate into destiny. Sometimes we have no control over our fate, but given that fate, can we turn it into destiny? I'm reminded of someone who paraphrased Rabbi Soloveitchik very well, Esther Waxman, whose son Nachshon was murdered in a terrorist attack. I'm sorry. He was picked up. Let me back up for a moment. The story was in the early 90s. Her son Nachshon was 18 years old and took a hitch in his Israeli soldier uniform. And the Hasidim, he thought they were Hasidim, they were terrorists. And so he was taken hostage. And the Prime Minister of Israel then, Yitzhak Rabin, ordered that an elite unit tried to free him. And actually, I promised myself always to mention the commander of that unit who lost his life trying to say Nachshon near Poraz. And they didn't succeed, and Nir Poraz died, and Nachshon was killed. And she was once asked, you lost a child in this way. How did you go on in life? And she paraphrased Rabbi Soloveitchik, and she said, I love this line, by the way, it pays to memorize. I had to ask myself, will I be a victim of my fate, or will I initiate a new destiny? Will I be a victim of my fate, or will I initiate a new destiny? Rabbi Soloveitchik, who's a very deep writer, after he says that a person must turn goral liyud, he writes, Adam tudato shel Adam lafoch goral liyud kiyum mushpa Kiyum mushpa likiyum mashpia, likiyum mushpa umufal, likiyum mashpia umafil. An existence of passivity to an existence of activity. And when we look in the Parsha, this is Acharei Mot. After the two sons of Aaron died, what I find fascinating, and this is a good way to bring all of this to closure, is it says, I'm now going to open up the Chumash. I'm reading now the beginning of the portion. And the portion says, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe, Acharei Mot, Shnei b'nei Aaron v'kovratam lifnei Adonai vayamutu. God is speaking to Moshe. Vayom Adonai el Moshe, Daber el Aaron achicha, speak to Aaron. And you would think, what would God tell Moses to tell Aaron? Maybe God should have told this to Aaron directly. He would give Moses the wisdom of how to comfort Aaron. I don't know if anyone could find such words, but what do you do? How do you comfort him? And that's not what happens. Right then, God details, this is what you should do. These are the actions that you should take. This is the service for the Kohen. It's the most important activity, the service on the day, the service of the Day of Atonement. And look, I think clearly there would have been an Israel without the Shoah. There would have been an Israel without the Holocaust. And those who say it's only the Holocaust are making a terrible, terrible mistake that feeds into the Arab narrative that if the Holocaust occurred, that is, if Israel was born only because of the Holocaust, then why are we in the Middle East? Let's take a piece of land in Germany or a piece of land in Austria or wherever the heck it is. Israel would have been before. The dream of Israel goes back to Abraham and Sarah. There would have been an Israel without the Holocaust, but I'm convinced there would have been no Holocaust if there were an Israel. And the activists always said the best response to the Holocaust is a strong state of Israel. Instead of devoting our energy, again, this is just one answer of many, but it's an answer that is close to my heart. Instead of devoting so much energy to why, to say, okay, this has occurred. Now, what now? What now? Now there's going to be a rebirth. There's going to be a rebirth. And Israel is a miracle. That is the best response. And with all the challenges that the Jewish community in America is facing, there has been significant growth as well. So just the Soloveitchik response is that the challenge is to turn fate into destiny. You know what it is? What I've shared with you many times, and that is my motto: never allow what we cannot do to control what we can do. Very important. You know, the Holocaust at one time, I think this was said before, I think Tova, you said it. There was a time in the first 10 years after the Holocaust, it was almost like we had just suffered a death. And there's this period of animut before burial where someone is immobilized, you can't even talk. The survivors couldn't talk. They were shell-shocked. They were busy moving on. And frankly, nobody wanted to hear the stories. Nobody wanted to hear their stories. Then the Eichmann trial, the 6-day war, we started sitting Shiva. We started telling the stories. That's really what happened. That's what happened in many, many ways. And the bottom line, though, is that as much as we tell the stories, you know, there are certain things we don't control. We don't control what happened 80 years ago. But, you know, there are people, you know, what happened at that time when the Holocaust became the in thing, it was almost like the Holocaust was defining our Judaism. That's not a healthy thing either. Holocaust is central. You know, I don't think the Holocaust should be in an encyclopedia under anti-Semitism. No, it's separate and distinct. It's under the Holocaust. It's under the Shoah, under Shin, not under the Aleph of anti-Semitism. It's separate and it's unique. But we should be careful not to allow Judaism to be defined by the Shoah. And that is to move on, to turn that fate, that horror, learn from it, turn fate into a new destiny. And for me, it's one of the basic messages of life, because no matter our situation, we have the capacity to turn fate into destiny. We have the capacity to turn, how did Netanyahu say it? Lemons into lemonade. We have that capacity to do that. And that's what the Rav said. That's what the Rav said. I want to stop here on this session, a very emotional session. I hope you found it of meaning, but I think we'll let Arnie have the last words. So Arnie, please. And I know Ezra's on, so put in a plug because Ezra is coordinating the Yom HaShoah program, and there's only one Ezra who does it like Ezra does. And I hope you'll be able to tune in. Arnie, you got the last word.
So I just have a couple of impressionistic thoughts based on everything you've said and the class has said. Elie Wiesel was fascinated, of all the biblical characters, I think he was most fascinated with Isaac. And he wrote a lot about how Isaac was the first Holocaust victim. But he also wrote, and I don't know which came first, which essay came first. He wrote a wonderful essay about how the naming of Isaac and Jewish laughter and Jewish optimism were created in our DNA a long, long time ago. And it was just as Elie Wiesel is known for his sobering thoughts about the Holocaust and humanity, he also had a wonderful gift to seeing the elevated heights that man could reach to. Also, as the Holocaust is receding in memory, I, like a lot of people, have worries about what that will mean. It comes about not only as the population is getting younger, and the Holocaust was a long ago history piece to them, and they've grown up, thank God, with a strong, competent Israel. I worked with a young Hispanic guy at one time, very bright guy, but not very well schooled. And we were talking about the Holocaust once, and he asked me why Israel didn't just go beat them up, you know? He had no understanding that there was no Israel back then. So, that's a concern, it's a worry. Lastly, I was thinking, when you talked about the holy disbelievers, I don't remember whether it's in Deuteronomy or in Exodus, but when they talk about Amalek attacking those in the rear and those who are, I forget the words that he used exactly, but I know that David Silber, among others, have talked about those who were despondent and discouraged and maybe had stopped believing in God. They were doubting, and God still protected them. And that, I guess that's a part of our DNA as well.
That's the story of Rabbi Spira's friend who says to him, I was holding on to your coattails. Thank you so much, everyone. Ruby, I know everybody's wishing you a refuah shlema. Feel better, Ruby. And Fern, overcome the COVID, and everybody, a refuah shlema. And Natalie, be well, everybody. God bless you all. Ezra, are you there?
Yes. Also, Shuli just wanted to pop in for a second before I start.
Thank you, Rav Ezra. Since a lot of people on the class, have maybe not been in the office recently, I wanted to introduce you to Susanna, who you've probably received emails from, but you may not have met in person. So I'm in the office today. So here's Susanna.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Susanna comes to us from London a while ago. She lived in America, but I'm really enjoying her accent, and you will also get to enjoy it if you call to buy it. She's the one that's answering the phones. And if you send an inquiry to the office, then she's likely the one that will respond. So I just wanted you to put a face to the name and the voice. And
That's
have a
so
great day,
nice.
everyone.
That's so nice. Thank you, Julie.
And I really want to
Maria.
offer
Very sweet.
a refuah shlema to all those who need healing, Ezra, to everybody. And also want to thinking of Chaya Mark, she should feel well. And just all my love to everybody. Blessings, brachot and ava rabba.
Great. We'll start at our class at 11:30. Give people a few minutes to either leave. No, don't leave. No,
We wouldn't leave
or
Ezra.
grab a drink or take a bio break or whatever you need to do. Yes, Estelle. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Stella, I just wanted to say that I